Hey everyone, my name is Jake Kay. I'm a district wildlife manager with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I work primarily in Summit County. Today I'm going to talk to you about moose, and specifically I'll give you a biological background of moose as well as take a look at their history in Colorado. For starters, let's look at their range worldwide, which is really expansive in this northern latitude. You see everywhere from Alaska all the way across Canada, parts of the lower 48, to the eastern coast of the United States and Canada, northern Europe, and all the way to the east coast of Asia, including even parts of China and Mongolia. So really expansive across the world. And we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but they're a cold weather species, and that's why we see them so high up north. So there's 6 subspecies of moose, and the moose we see here in Colorado and in the Rocky Mountains is the Shiras subspecies. And you can look at this map. This is essentially the general population of Shiras moose that we have, as well as some of the other North American moose subspecies. Now, the Shiras moose is the smallest of all the moose in the world. So if we look at the moose population in the lower 48, which again are all these Shiras moose subpopulation, we have about 25 to 30,000. And of course, that's a ballpark estimate. A lot of states aren't surveying every year or are just giving general estimates, but we're somewhere in this 25 to 30,000 range most likely. And if you look at this, Colorado is really the southern extent of the moose population in the lower 48. Occasionally we'll have one that wanders into New Mexico, but there's no resident populations down there. So moose are the largest member of the Cervidae family. That includes deer, elk, and moose. And moose, of course, are the biggest of the 3 species. The Shiras moose is about 600 to 1,200 pounds and can be up to 6 feet tall at the shoulders. Something you'll notice about moose, you've probably seen before if you've seen moose, is this dewlap or this flap of skin hanging from the throat. Contrary to popular belief, it's not just the male moose that have it, or what we call bull moose, but also the females, which are called cow moose. They have that as well too. So you'll see that flap of skin, and it can vary in size. They often have a pretty prominent shoulder hump. You'll see that's something you wouldn't really see on deer or elk. And then they're also typically a lot darker than deer and elk. Their coats can even look black at times. And they have these white stocking caps on their lower legs and on the inside of their legs. But in general, when you see a really big dark thing moving around the woods, especially around here, it's probably going to be a moose. And then lastly, unlike deer and elk, their antlers are palmated. So they're wide and thick like the palm of a hand. This is not a big bull moose. But you'll see some pictures of them where you can really see that palmation. So where do we find moose? A lot of you might know this if you've been out hiking or biking or even driving around. But they actually occupy a lot of different areas. So in general, I'd say forested areas that are near water. Around here, you typically see them in riparian areas. They're cold weather species. They rely on a lot of aquatic plant species to eat, and it helps keep them cool. And so where we typically see them is areas of willows, which is one of their primary forages, but they go everywhere. I mean, depending on where you go, whether you're in Colorado, Montana, Canada, they can occupy all kinds of different habitats. They'll use sagebrush all the way up to the alpine above tree line. So we typically see them in these riparian areas, and some of that's due to a lot of roads are built next to creeks and riverbeds and ponds. You can find moose just about anywhere if you're looking. So moose is actually an Algonquin Native American term for eater of twigs. So unlike cows, for example, domestic cows which graze, they're mostly browsers. They eat a lot of shrubs. Willows, like the one in the picture here that we have a lot of around here, that's a huge part of their diet, especially in the winter. Now in the summer, they will switch to some grasses, some forbs, and they'll even eat some of that underwater aquatic vegetation. You can actually see them dipping their head in, and moose in some areas actually dive down to get some of that vegetation. All right, looking at the reproduction. So they'll breed in late September and early October. That's when there's the rut. And typically one bull moose or a male moose will breed, 2 to 4 female cows. So they're polygamous breeders. And cows start breeding usually around 2 to 3 years old, but it oftentimes depends on their nutrition and if they're able to breed and support offspring. Now, moose generally have an 8-month gestation period, so they'll give birth in late May and early June. And this is also typically the same time, the same birth pulse as deer and elk. So you'll see these calves and fawns and everything from deer and elk all mostly around the same time. In fact, we just had that period, and there's still going to be a bunch of little guys running around right now that you can see. Now, a lot of people are curious, do moose always have twins or how often? And it really ranges. Studies have shown twinning rates are 0 to 90%. And most of that's due to nutrition. So a really healthy population with a ton of good forage can have some really high twinning rates. Now, this number in Colorado, I found it's a little bit older, but it said twinning rates in Colorado were about 12%, pretty low. I wouldn't rely on that entirely, but we probably have lower twinning rates than some other areas. Now, some interesting facts about moose. They are great swimmers. As we've been talking about, they really like, riparian areas, areas of ponds, marshes, rivers, areas with a lot of water. And they can swim really well, and they can even dive down to 6 feet to grab vegetation underwater. They can run up to 35 miles an hour. So I think a lot of people, and this is why we have conflicts with them, is we think they're these huge, mammoth, slow-moving, docile creatures, but they're not. They can run really fast, a lot faster than we can. They can live up to 20 years old in the wild. Typically, we're going to see not nearly as long, maybe 7 or 8 years, and in areas where they're not hunted, probably 10 to 15 years could be more the average. Moose tend to have poor eyesight, but they have a really excellent sense of hearing and smell. So that's what they rely on more than their eyesight. Now, something here that you probably know, and it's a bit controversial, but we really don't have many natural predators of moose in Colorado, especially adult moose. We do now have some wolf activity that we're trying to sort out, but we don't really have many resident populations yet. But realistically, there's not many natural threats to moose outside of vehicles. Now, moose calves, when they're young, they can get eaten by mountain lions or bears, things like that. But mom will typically be really protective. So in general, we say we don't really have many natural predators of moose in Colorado. So something I think is really cool, because I can't stand the heat, but moose are incredibly heat intolerant or cold tolerant. They can be comfortable in temperatures up to negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. And the downside is they get heat stressed really early. So in the winter, when they grow their really warm winter coat, their thick winter coat, they begin to be heat stressed at about 23 degrees Fahrenheit. In the summer, when they lose that winter coat, they can tolerate warmer temperatures, but it's still pretty low, 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that can all depend on whether it's a windy day or if they're in the shade of the sun, but bottom line is this is a cold weather creature. And they don't tolerate heat very well, which is why we find them up north, Canada, Alaska, and why we often see them near water. So let's talk about moose in particular in Colorado, because traditionally we haven't had many moose down here. There's always been moose, but we're the southern extent, and a lot of that's because it's just warmer down here. Some historical accounts talk about seeing a lot of deer, some elk, but not that many moose. But they were here, just not in huge numbers. And a lot of the natives would see them, but we had no real game and fish laws, so it wasn't regulated. And so of the few moose that were down here, a lot of them were getting shot and killed. So that probably also suppressed the population. But starting in the 50s, we began advocating for reintroducing moose to Colorado. We knew that we had a ton of good habitat, especially back then. There weren't a lot of people on the western slope and in other mountainous areas. Plus, we had eliminated wolves. There wasn't a lack of predators, so it felt like it'd be a good place to bring back in, and it would contribute to wildlife viewing, tourism. It could eventually provide hunting opportunity and just restore one of our native mammals that was never here in huge numbers, but was definitely here. So we began moose reintroductions in 1978. So we brought 24 moose in from Utah and Wyoming, and they were planted in North Park, which is now usually known as the moose capital of Colorado. So you can see I'm circling here where the red number 1 is. So that's where they started with just 24 moose. Then about 10 years later, they went to the Laramie River Valley and put 12 moose there from Wyoming. After that, they did a really big reintroduction down in the San Juan. So you can see way down here in southwestern Colorado, because we have this huge expanse of mountains down there and a lot of great habitat. So we introduced 93 moose, combination from Wyoming, Utah, and even some of our own in Colorado, now that we had this northern population up here beginning to establish itself and do very well. So next up was the Grand Mesa, another 91 moose. Those came from Utah. And if you haven't been out there, it's pretty neat. It's fairly flat, but it's really forested, a ton of water, a lot of lakes. So you can, when you go out there, you can tell why it'd be good moose habitat. And then our last reintroduction was up kind of in the northwest flat tops in that Meeker Craig area up high. And we got 39 moose, again, split from Utah and some of our own in Colorado. But really, since then, moose have expanded a ton on their own. We'll go see here that, this is an estimate from 2015, it's probably changed a bit, but from those initial reintroductions, moose have really expanded. And what's even neater is that the populations are becoming interconnected. You can see where there were gaps before and now. Really, realistically, moose are almost all connected throughout the state.
So in Colorado, we have about 3,200 moose, and they span across 63 game management units. So just like that map we were looking at on the last slide, they're really widespread throughout Colorado. And we had last year about 20,000 people apply for a moose hunting license, of which we issued out 540 licenses. And of those 540 licenses, 353 people harvested a moose. So that's about 10, 11% of the population. And Colorado's moose population in general is doing really well. A lot of the other populations in the Mountain West are declining because they've been around for a long time. They've reached their carrying capacity. And of course, humans are expanding, developing over good habitat. So moose in a lot of other states, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, are either stable or declining. Colorado, on the other hand, is actually growing, one of the few populations that is expanding. And that's because we haven't fulfilled our niche. There's still room, still pretty good habitat in the state. Some areas we're certainly starting to overcrowd with moose, but as a state, as a whole, there's room for the moose population to grow at least a little bit more.
So we'll look here at a little bit more local of level in what we in Colorado Parks and Wildlife call a data analysis unit, and we have these for every species. So the M3, which is moose data analysis unit, covers Summit County, Grand County, and a bit of Eagle and Route County. Now, when we fly, we don't have the funding to count moose specifically every year. We typically have the funding from licenses to count deer and elk. So the moose that we see are opportunistic sightings. We're not flying an airplane specifically to find the moose. So therefore, this estimate we have from last year is not very likely to be accurate and is probably low. But we did get an estimate from our model of about 264 moose in this M3 data analysis unit. Realistically, there's probably more, maybe 300, 350, but we're still well above our management objective of about 190 moose. Last year, hunters harvested 80 moose. We had 107 moose die overall. So essentially those extra 27 mortalities came mostly from vehicle collisions, but also from unknown mortalities or stuck in a fence or sick moose, things like that. The 3-year average age of harvested male moose was 4.5 years, so 4.5. And for females, it was just a little bit younger, about 4 years. So that's in general about the age structure of our moose population in M3 there. Now let's talk about moose conflicts a bit because we deal with this a ton here. And that goes along with the expansion of moose that we're seeing in Summit County and even in Grand County as well up north. But the bottom line is when we're talking about moose, they're dangerous. We typically think of bears, mountain lions, and whatnot, but my personal thought is I'd rather run into a bear, mountain lion than a moose up close and personal. And a big thing is that moose in general are not afraid of humans. They're huge and they don't need to be. And some will run away when you see them, but others will stand their ground or investigate. So some guidelines to avoid moose conflicts. Never approach a moose. Always watch it from a distance. We have the rule of thumb where if you can cover that animal up with the tip of your thumb, then you're at a good distance. But if you can't, you're too close. And again, we think they're friendly and slow moving and these gentle creatures. And they could be, but more often than not, if you approach a moose, you're going to get stomped. So even though they may look approachable or act habituated to humans, giving yourself space is always going to be the best bet. And never feed moose. And this goes for all wildlife. First of all, it's illegal. But also, this is how we habituate animals. And we see this in Summit County a ton with foxes and bears and everything else. And once they get fed, they tend to hang around human houses. And that's when we have these issues where people get hurt or property gets damaged. And then we have to either relocate or euthanize the moose. Now, a huge thing is dogs. So a moose's biggest natural predator is wolves. They evolved to avoid and to fight wolves when they need to. So when they see a dog, it's the same thing. They get angry. They're more easily provoked when there's dogs around barking, and they become aggressive. And so what I would recommend to any and all of you is if you have a dog, keeping on leash is great for all wildlife, but especially if you know there's moose there, because oftentimes your dog will run after the moose, bark, and then the moose will chase that dog, and your dog's coming right back to you, bringing it into your lap. And a lot of people get stomped that way, is that their dog essentially provokes a moose and brings it right back to their owner. So really be careful with dogs, because they essentially look like a wolf to any moose out there, and they react accordingly, stand their ground, and get aggressive and defend themselves. Now, if a moose charges, and this is different than, let's say, a bear or a mountain lion. If a moose charges, run away and get away fast, and try and put a big object between you and that moose, something that you can either hide in or behind, just to separate you. Now, maybe if you happen to somehow, unfortunately, be real close to a moose, signs to look for to know whether this moose is curious versus aggressive. An aggressive moose is going to lay their ears back. This is common in a lot of animals. You might have seen it even with your dog. If it's growling at something, it's going to put its ears back. Moose do the same thing. So that's something pretty easily recognizable. Another thing is the hackles on their back raise up. It may be a little difficult to see. This photo's blurry, but it's pretty neat actually, and a little terrifying, but their hackles will go up. They'll let you know. They'll put their ears back. They'll raise the hair on their back and their neck up. They'll lick their lips. That's a sign of stress, as well as anger. They're about to basically get ready to be aggressive. They're uncomfortable. And when you see all these three signs, you really got to be careful. So moose deterrence, how do we avoid having issues with moose in the first place? For starters, do not feed them. I already mentioned this once, but it's illegal if you're feeding them, grain or putting out food specifically for them. But even if it's just your garden, moose are going to get it. I mean, why wouldn't they come into your backyard if you've got a buffet in your planter box for them, right? So that's just something to think about, is that moose generally are coming onto your property either for some kind of cover like shade or a protected area, or for food. That's a big thing. If you got an apple tree, plum tree, whatever, or you got lettuce growing in the planter box, moose are going to hit that. Same with deer and elk. If you do end up having a moose on your property, don't run at them like you would maybe a fox or a coyote, something like that. Give them time and space to leave, and eventually they will move on. If you do need to get them off your property or away from your car, air horns seem to work well. Something else that they seem to dislike is if you fill a soda can or a beer can or anything like that with coins and shake that around. That can help move them off. Something to, if you are going to have a garden or plants, is you can spray some plant skid repellent on them so that they're not going to want to eat it. And so they may wander in your yard, but once they realize they don't want to eat your plants, they'll typically move on. Something else that can be effective with a lot of critters is electric fencing. So if you have the time and the money, electric fencing is another good way to keep moose out of your place. So that's all I have for you today. I hope that was some valuable information, and I'm happy to stick around for questions. as long as you guys would like. So thanks for having me today. I appreciate it, and I'll look forward to questions.